another feature that I want to talk to you about, and that is when you do it, there's video links for over 200 of the items in there. Some of the critical language skills and some of the imitative skills and so forth have links where you can actually download streaming media onto your computer so you can watch maybe a 20 to 30 second or 40-second clip of what the skill's supposed to look like. So if you're working with, let's say, a teacher in a classroom and you've got your instructional assistants, you can go online and actually for staff training purposes, you can click on it and say, this is what I want you to get Johnny to do. I want him to be able to do these types of things, and here's kind of how it looks. So that right away they can see it. You don't have to rely on just a verbal description and great details. You can just show them what it's supposed to look like.
And that's huge with so many of these teachers because verbal description does not always do it for them.
Right, right. So this is one of the features that I'm very, very proud of, is the fact that we built that in for people to make it easy for them.
That is fantastic.
Thank
What
you.
do you think is the likelihood of getting school systems on board with using this WebAbles?
Well, we're already starting to get some school systems using it. Now, they're using it pretty much on a limited basis right now as they're learning it, but we've got several districts where we're involved with the district, working with them on their classrooms. We've set up model classrooms for several districts now, and we put their children's scores on the WebAbles so we can work together as a consultation team with them in developing it. But we are finding some organizations now are adopting this because they realize the efficiency of it. It takes a while for people to realize just what the benefits are, but once people see it and they see just how it works, they're pretty impressed by the fact that it's a real time saver for them. And you know, every teacher will tell you they need to save as much time as they possibly can,
right,
because you don't want them spending all their time doing paperwork. You want them guiding the education of the children, actually working with the children, supervising the instructional assistants who are working. So the more you can minimize all this paperwork for them, make it easy, and have a consistent tracking such that when the child goes from one teacher to the next, they've already got the information about what the child can and can't do. Their targets are more easily identified. Because one of the things that happens in a lot of special education programs is people sit down and they try to develop an IEP based on some descriptions of the child, and they're not really thinking about what are all those other skills that this child may not have. And then you end up with problems because right, the children, if they're working on a task that's way too hard for them, oftentimes their behavior will be such that they'll try to get this to stop. Maybe they'll act cute, they'll put their head in their lap, or maybe they'll act tired. Maybe they'll start knocking things off the table. They'll do things that slow up the instruction because they're not being successful at it. And so if you're going to keep the motivation of a child with autism, you've got to make sure they're getting adequate reinforcement for their participation. Problem is, if you're doing something that's just way too hard for you, or you're having difficulty learning, then you're going to get what we call this escape and avoidance behavior.
Right.
And so it's really important that people pick skills at the appropriate level for children, and the ABLES helps lay that out for them. It helps make it easy for them to say, oh, this skill is a little bit easier than that skill. Maybe we should teach that one first before we start worrying about these harder skills.
Well, there's so many prerequisite skills, especially early in the kindergarten, first and second grade, that are so critical that I don't think get identified in the kids with autism, because there's the assumption that they just get that from osmosis like everyone else.
By learning, by watching others and imitating. And that's
this is a
problem.
huge tool.
It is, and one thing I'd like to talk about with regard to that is, you know, that issue of trying to integrate children into regular education programs. One of the difficulties that I see is, of course, everybody wants their kid to make it into regular education. They want them to be just like all the other kids, you know, riding their bicycles in the cul-de-sac with the other kids in the neighborhood, being just like the other kids in the neighborhood. And so do I. So do I. The problem, though, is that sometimes people grab some pieces of information about the child's performance and they take that to indicate that this child is ready to be like the other children and learn like the other children. For example, many times children will be taught to identify words and letters and numbers and count, and they look like they've got the basic academics. And if a child likes that, that's fine. There's no reason not to do that. However, by teaching these basic academics, which are fairly simplistic in many ways when you stop to think about it, just having those skills doesn't mean that they're ready for first grade because they can count and they can read some words, they can maybe even give some sounds of letters, sound out some words. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to sit in a classroom with a child in first grade and be able to learn like those first graders. Many times these children still are lacking many basic language skills, especially what we call the intraverbals. That's basically talking about things in their absence, if you will. You say something and I say something related to it. So you say, oh, tell me some sports, and I say, oh, there's baseball and there's hockey. I might be able to answer some questions, if you will, talk about topics, and name some animals, or let's talk about some things you might do after school. We might be able to talk about things like that, or describe things. Can you describe a bicycle to me? Well, some of the children with autism may be able to label items, they may be able to ask for items, they may be able to receptively identify items, but if they can't talk about items in their absence, then you're going to have some problems, because once you get into education, yes, the first year might be some simple academics, some counting, some numbers, following simple directions, but soon it gets into very, very complex language-based activities. You're talking about science issues, you're talking about social studies types of issues, you're talking about, the weather, you're talking about who settled in North America, where did they come from and what did they trade. Well, if you've got an individual who can't pay attention to and respond to language like that, they're going to be lost. And even though they may have some academic skills that look like they're on par with the other children, if their language skills haven't been adequately addressed, they're going to be in trouble. And that's where you'll find a lot of children can get into kindergarten or first grade, but they're still not learning in group instruction. They're still not talking about things in their absence very well. They're not talking about what they've done, who they saw, where they were, what they did on different days. And so now you get them into a classroom and they look like they're doing all right for maybe kindergarten, first grade, but second grade, third grade, all of a sudden people start realizing they're not keeping up. And then it's, what do we do now? So you're right, it's not just a matter of being there with other kids. It's not through osmosis they're going to get this. This is because they've learned some critical learner skills that really allow them to learn from their everyday interactions with others. And so that's the whole idea behind the ABLES, is to try to take a look and define, show what those skills might be. Again, not that anything's perfect, but it certainly seems to be a good way of at least gauging at this point in time how we go forward with children.
That is wonderful. Well, I know you also have a new book that has just recently come out. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Thank you for asking. I just finished a book. It just came out yesterday. It's called Capturing the Motivation of Children with Autism or Other Developmental Disabilities. And what the book does is goes through and presents technical information in a non-technical manner. There are many parents out there and educators who really want to help children. They've got the heart, they want to help, but now they need the technical knowledge. The problem is, sometimes in professions, the words turn people off. They think they know what a concept is, like reinforcement. It's a simple concept that's very, very much misunderstood. Because what I'll often do when I'm talking to a large audience, I'll pull out like a $20 bill, and I'll say, is this a reinforcer? And everybody's shaking their head going, yes, yes. And I said, okay, now we got to go back to basics. Because you can't tell me if something's a reinforcer or not just by seeing it. The reinforcer is only identified after it's shown to have a strengthening effect upon behavior. But people don't realize that. So you have people describing things like they're saying, well, I had a reinforcer and I was using a reinforcer, but it wasn't working. Well, by definition, it wasn't a reinforcer. So we've got to go back to the basics. So what I've tried to do, I'm writing a series of books. It's called Teach Your Children Well series. And it's based on providing technical information to people in a non-technical manner so that people who have an interest in working with children can grasp the concepts and utilize them for working with some fairly difficult children who have difficulty learning skills. So anyhow, in this book, Capturing the Motivation, what it does is it really goes through taking a look at all the variables that might affect a child's willingness to participate and go along with you when you're trying to teach them. Whether you be trying to teach them something sitting down at a table, or whether you're in the bathroom getting them ready to take a bath where you're trying to teach them some skills there. There's different conditions that you experience with the child, and we talk about it in technical terms of instructional control. Will they follow along and go along with us under a wide variety of conditions? And it turns out that it all comes back to reinforcement issues. What's the reinforcer? Do you have a reinforcer? Is it clear that you have a reinforcer that's better than what the child can get on their own for free? The last several years I've been talking about this concept called ambient reinforcement. I kind of picked that term because it kind of seemed to fit. You know, you walk into a room and you see a child with autism and they're doing something. They're not just sitting there waiting for the world to pass them by. They're actively doing something. In fact, that's what kind of drives some people nuts, is because they see the kids getting into all kinds of stuff and now what do? We've got a behavior problem. But in reality, what the child's doing is exploring their environment. They're manipulating the environment to have some desired outcome. Maybe they're getting some certain type of sound that they make when they tap on something in a certain way. Or maybe when they put their head down and they look along the edge of something, they see a certain way in which the light's bouncing off the edge, or they're seeing the reflection in the refrigerator or in a glass of water, or they're watching the light in terms of how it's, you know, cutting through the air and maybe making dust particles move. I mean, they're attending to all kinds of stuff, and they're making things happen. They can smell things, they can taste things, they can feel things. And so they have access to stimulus change, if we call that reinforcers, that they control on their own, that they don't need us for. And now here we come along and we're trying to get them to do something for us, but they're already entertaining themselves in some way. So why should they do something for us when they're already doing something that is pretty much a little effort for them, doesn't depend upon us? Now we're coming in and we're going to ask them to do something else that might be a little difficult for them. There has to be some major difference in terms of what they can get for free versus what we have to offer them. And so I think that's where part of the time people don't understand that, and they don't understand they're competing with these ambient reinforcers. They don't control all the reinforcers. Another concept that they don't understand is the fact that motivation is switching from second to second. They may like something right now, but all of a sudden they're tired of it pretty quickly. And what people have a tendency to do is, if you're working with the child and now you're getting them to do things for you, let's say you're having them name different items on picture cards or something like that, some simple task. And all of a sudden they're working really well, and you're feeling really good as a therapist because you're reinforced by watching the child participate so well. And so you want to keep it going because you're getting reinforced for what you're doing. However, what happens is that oftentimes the parents or the teachers, people who are working with the child, will often push it because they want to keep it going. Unfortunately, the motivation may be dying off for the reinforcers that they have access to, and you go from a child who's responding extremely well, paying very focused attention, giving you very quick answers, to all of a sudden it starts getting slowed down a little bit, and then all of a sudden you stop. Well, what you're ending up doing when you're ending up stopping is you're ending up stopping for not the most desired performance. So if you want to get better performance, you want to stop before it starts to taper off. Now, some of my colleagues kind of started describing it as not keeping the motivational variable on life support. In other words, if you're losing, if they're no longer, don't keep going. Stop. Find another reinforcer. Right. Capture another one so that you really get the best performance being developed, and you're always ending before the child starts to engage in escape and avoidance behavior. So there's that. There's other issues that I describe in the book that I think are very important too. You know, people are always worried about children getting hooked on extrinsic reinforcement. It used to be the M&Ms. Now it could be the organically grown raisins. It doesn't matter what the trend is for the time. But the idea is you're giving them something. They're doing something for something you control. And what we find is that children on the autism spectrum, one of the major areas is a social piece. And so you've got this issue of children who may not be as responsive to social reinforcement. Praise, or smiles, or little change of tone of voice may not be an actual reinforcer for many of the children. Now, hopefully through our training, when we're doing it, we do it right. And that is, if we're going to use something else, like music, singing, or giving them raisins, what they might do is make sure that they pair their change in their facial expression, their tone of voice, their posture even, with right before they get the other backup reinforcers, so that pretty soon the child starts to see that, oh, before I get these raisins, Jim starts to smile. He leans forward, his voice changes a little bit. That's a good thing, because it always precedes a delivery of something that the child wants. That's how you take a neutral stimulus, like our facial change, tone of voice, and turn it into a conditioned reinforcer. And there's a lot of science behind that too, in terms of how that happens. For instance, if I were to give a raisin to a child and then say, good job, well, he's eating the raisin. He's not paying attention to the words or my facial expression at that time. It's better if I, oh, you did a good job, and then I deliver it. So now he sees the change in my face and my tone of voice, and then gets reinforced. Those become important now. So these are some of the things that I'm addressing in the book, trying to lay it out for parents and professionals in a simple manner so that they understand these concepts without having to get into the subtle nuances of all the technical language that's used by a behavior analyst.